Okay, everybody, it is 10 o'clock. I'm going to start this meeting of the Public Rights of Way Subcommittee. Hi, Mr. Powell, if you come off screen until it's your turn to speak. Thank you. So before we start, please can I remind everyone that this meeting is being live streamed and the recording archived for future viewing. If a participant wishes to speak, please use the raise hand function and the chair will indicate when it's your turn to speak. So please then select the request to speak button, which will allow you to come on screen. Please ensure that all debate is raised verbally and not via the chat function. The chat function should only be used to highlight any technical issues or to get the attention of the chair or Democratic and Scrutiny Services Officer. So moving on straight to the agenda, please claim nominations for the position of chair. Thank you. Councillor Drake, will you come on screen, please?
I'll nominate Councillor Neil Thomas, please.
Okay, do we have a seconder?
I'll second that.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, are there any other nominations? Okay, I've not seen any yet, so I'll ask then Councillor Neil Thomas to become chair for this municipal bill. Thank you. Councillor Thomas, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for that. I think the next item on the agenda then is to nominate vice chair, and I'd like to nominate Councillor Pamela Drake, please.
I'd like to second that.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah. Any other nominations? No. In that case, Pam, congratulations again. Right, moving on to the business at hand, I think, is the next item on the agenda. I don't have the agenda in front of me. I've got the report.
It's just apologies, Chair. We're all present, unless members have anything that need to leave early or we won't be able to stay for the duration, but all members are present, Chair. Yeah,
and remind everyone that in order to vote and everything, you need to be present throughout the meeting. Right, moving on then to the report itself. Who's presenting the report?
Sorry, Chair, can we just take declarations as well? Do you have any declarations of interest?
Yeah, I think it's important, Gareth. I'm a town councillor and they've been involved with this application. So I'm a double-hatted councillor, so it's non-pecuniary interest, and just to make you aware. As part of the process that's been going on for some time, I will look at this report with fresh and therefore make the decision subject to the discussion we take today.
Thank you.
Gwyn.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm a member of Lantern Major Town Council, but this morning I will be speaking as a Vale Glamorgan councillor, and I did not support this proposition in the Town Council meeting just a few weeks ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Gwyn. Any other declarations of interest then? I see none. In that case, as I say, I don't have the agenda in front of me. I have the report, but not the agenda. I presume there's nothing. We move now onto the report itself, and I think that's Gwyn Teague.
Yeah, sorry, Chair. David Hunt will present the report first, and so if we can ask David Hunt to come on screen, and then he can take us through a brief background. Thank you, Chair.
Can I say, Chair, that we did have on item number 4 minutes of the meeting held on the 6th of September, 2023.
Of course, yes. In that case, thanks for that, Pam. As I say, I don't have the agenda up for some reason. In that case, are there anything from the minutes, or would someone like to move the minutes?
Move with notes, Chair. Thank you.
We know. Thank you.
I'll second those.
Thank you, Pam. Now we can move on to David then.
Okay, good morning. So yeah, I'm David Hunt, the Countryside Access Manager for Public Rights of Way in the Vale. Just a quick summary. This meeting is to determine an application for modification of a definitive mapping statement under the Wildlife and Countryside Act 1981. This deals with the claim that a route running from the adopted highway at Boverton Mill Farm to the public footpath number 3 at Summerhouse Point, Lantern Major, should be recorded as a public right-of-way on the definitive map and statement. So the report sets out all the relevant evidence and legal tests, including the weight that can be given to that evidence to inform the determination on whether or not to make the order. This subcommittee is required to assess the evidence and determine whether to make an appropriate modification order, given effect to that evidence, or to decline the application. In making the determination, the subcommittee must base its consideration on the legal tests outlined in the appended investigation report, which will be presented shortly by our representative, Gwyn. Our recommendation from the Vale is that the council does make a definitive map order in respect to the application. The background and reason for the recommendation is set out within the appended report. So I'll now hand over to Gwyn to present the investigation report on our behalf. Thank you.
Thanks, David. So what I will do is I've got a PowerPoint presentation that I will attempt to share. And if that doesn't work, then I might ask Gareth to, he's got a copy of it. I will attempt to do that. So let's see. So I mean, I can't see anybody now either, so I can just see my screen. Can you see that?
Oh, it's not come up yet. It's just you and.
Let me try again then. So let's try and do.
Can you do the thing? Sorry, let me just see if it's are we activated? Just bear with us. Just give it a few seconds, Gwyn. It does take some time to load up. No, the other one.
I know, but I pressed that one and it didn't work.
There we go.
How about that?
It's up. Yep.
That.
Can you see that?
Yep.
Lovely. Okay, great. So obviously, I'm going to present the investigation report. It's quite detailed. I'm going to assume that everyone's had the investigation report in paper copy. I mean, there's obviously a much more sort of thorough, detailed version in there, so I'll try to just lead you through it. I can't see what's going on sort of beyond the shared screen, so it's probably best if there's any questions to just note them down and ask me at the end if that's something that the committee procedure allows. So this is the investigation report that relates to a claim that's for a track to be added to the definitive map from Boverton Mill Farm to Summerhouse Point. And the bit that we're looking at, if anybody's unfamiliar with it, is this track that's listed from A to B, the dashed line that's running down on the map that you can see on the screen. Point A is joining to the existing adopted highway near Boverton Mill Farm at the top, and point B to
Sorry, Gwyn. Sorry,
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Have you moved the slide on? Could we still got the first slide appearing?
Okay. Would it be better if you run the presentation from your side?
I'll share it, yeah. We'll just change over. Just bear with me.
Okay.
Okay, that should be on screen.
Yep, that's great. So that's the first slide. So yeah, we are running from point A, which you can see on the top of that map. That is the connecting to the adopted highway near Boverton Mill Farm, down to point B, which is the top end of public footpath 3. And the track that you're looking at is that dashed black line that's running all the way through there. So the aim of the report's obviously to set out the all the relevant evidence and also the legal tests and the weights that can be added to each of them, and try to give you a bit of an analysis of that evidence and an opinion on it. If we have the next slide. So just to recap before we go, I mean, I'm aware that the committee's had a bit of training, so I should know an awful lot of this anyway, but this is an application under the Wildlife and Countryside Act for the addition of a public right-of-way. There's certain tests that you're looking at to try to meet when you're assessing the evidence that we're putting in front of you. So crucially, these are like the big ones. You can look at it in one of two ways, either by having rights under the Highways Act, Section 31, or under common law. So the first thing we tend to look at is the criteria under the Highways Act. And for those, then just to recap, it's the use can't be criminal, so it can't be incompatible with common law presumption of dedication. That's quite wordy, but effectively we mean that you can't acquire rights on the basis of a criminal act. Needs to have actually been enjoyed, so it needs to have been had sufficient use for the required period. It has to be by the public at large, so members of the public have to be using it generally, and it can't be claimed on the basis of private individuals just using it for their own purposes, sort of purely. One of the big ones tends to be that it needs to be used as of right. As of right is a bit of a strange legal term, but effectively means without force, without secrecy, or without permission. So if you've used a route, having forced your way through, done it all secretly, or more pertinently for this one, where there has been some sort of revocable permission or license that has enabled public access or supported public access, then that's can't contribute towards acquiring a right. It needs to be without interruption, so no actual physical stopping up, but that needs to be an intentional thing, really, not an incidental, like if somebody's put a skip on a path or something like that to clear something else, then that's just incidental. It wouldn't count, but otherwise we'd be looking for any periods of interruption. Under the Highways Act, we're looking for use for up to 20 years, or sorry, for 20 years or over, rather, and that precedes the dates that rights were called into question, so the point at which use was challenged, usually. And then finally, we need to look at whether there was an intention not to dedicate and whether there's been any demonstration of that. So that would be overt acts by landowners or their representatives that challenge use on it or make it really clear that they weren't intending to dedicate at that point. I'll have next slide, please. So in tandem with those criteria under the Highways Act, the alternative is that rights can be acquired under common law. That's a lot more fluid. There's no minimum time on that, but the shorter the time that you're looking at, the stronger the evidence of use and actions that a landowner might have taken in order to lay out a path for public use. And also, you need to demonstrate somebody that's got capacity to offer rights to the public in that case. So there needs to be a landowner that controls the title. If certain types of trusts, the way they're constituted, for instance, aren't capable of doing that, and so that would play its part in that. Take the next slide. For this case as well, we'll circle back to this towards the end of the presentation, but pertinently for this one, mechanically propelled vehicles and how they interact with the definitive map, and also how other technicalities have affected the rights that support them in the future are relevant. So the application is to add a path to the definitive map. The definitive map is only allowed to record certain highways. They are footpaths, bridleways, restricted byways, and byways open to all traffic. And byways open to all traffic have got a very precise definition where they can be used by motorised vehicles, but are mainly used for the purposes that footpaths or bridleways are used for. Come on back onto that later. Any other sort of forms of public highway, so like higher status routes, so roads mainly used by vehicles, or indeed cycleways, then they are not recorded on the definitive map, so they wouldn't be subject to this sort of order. And finally, just to mention at this point, there was an Act of Parliament, the Natural Environment and Rural Communities Act 2006, which came in and it extinguished all unrecorded vehicular rights. It did that subject to some exceptions, so some criteria for what things needed to pass in order to not be extinguished, which very loosely break down into it needed to be part of the ordinary roads network, and also where they were highways expressly created or dedicated for mechanically propelled vehicles. But that is a subject that we'll come back onto in a bit. We'll take the next slide. This one's a little bit of administration, and it appears in the report, so I'll just repeat it here. As part of this process, then the applicant needs to serve a notice on the landowner just to let them know that the application has been made, and then confirmed the local authority that that's been done. That was done. There's an excerpt there that shows the certification that it was carried out. Okay, and next slide. So we'll start off really by giving you a bit of background, and I'll try to whiz through this. It's in much more detail in the investigation report, but a bit of background on the area that we are looking at. So we're looking at Lantwick Major, the southern end, just eastern end of Lantwick Major, and the track that's running from Bovington Mill Farm down to Summerhouse Point. And I've given you a slightly wider map on this slide than we had in the application route earlier on, just so you can get your bearings a little bit. Down at the southern end, where it connects to footpath 3 runs into Summerhouse Point. And Summerhouse Point has got a very, very long and ancient history. So in the 4th century BC, that was established as an Iron Age promontory fort. Following records through then, Burton or Boverton estate was established in about 1090. And as was the case with agriculture prior to the agricultural revolution, then it was by and large sort of unhedged and unenclosed. And the first sort of bits of modern day field pattern that you'll start to see come about in the 15th century when the estate fields begin to be let out into small enclosures. Down at the southern end, on top of the old Iron Age fort, there was a coney warren established and a warrener's cottage. Rabbit fur was very important towards the end of that period. And so that represents the first modern settlement down at the end of the track. Moving along to the 18th century, and Summerhouse, the Summerhouse itself was constructed before 1730. The coney warren that was there previously was repurposed as servant quarters at that time. And this was all owned by Mr. Sayes at the time, and the enclosure of the Summerhouse, the walled Summerhouse, was speculated to be quite a lavish affair. In 1730, there's been some suggestion that Mr. Sayes appealed to the court leet in respect of the road and asked for it to be taken on and maintained by the public at large. Moving on to the early 19th century, and the Summerhouse begins to be sold through various different owners, ultimately ending up with Sir John Guest or Lord Winburn, and he retains ownership of that until the 20th century. It remains habitable until about 1930. Continue to the next slide. So also of interest then in the 19th century, you can just about see it on that map down in the bottom right-hand corner. Then there's a little feature that's marked Old Pier. There was a pier that was in place just down there. That was initially used to receive transport of lime that would come into the pier. Later on, there's records of it being used by smugglers and some of the local constabulary chasing across the field. Throughout the 19th century, there's records of the highway surveyor, an orange punter, commissioning maintenance of the road and ensuring it was being repaired. And then again, throughout from about the 19th century onwards, then you can see the track appearing on Ordnance Survey maps quite distinctly. The tithe and apportionment map is also an early map from that period that continues to show this track. The 1930s sees the establishment of Havard Girls' Camp That's in 1932, and that is just to the east of Summerhouse Point. And in 1936, the Special Areas Act comes in, and Boverton Place Farm falls within that. So the Special Areas Act, in the middle of the 1930s, then the country's in the grip of depression, and they introduced the Special Areas Act in order to try to provide some employment from people that were up in the industrial valleys and some of the industrial heartlands, and bring them down and teach them land skills and engage them in agriculture. And to do that, a number of farms and agricultural tenancies were picked up by the Crown, and people have moved down to there. So this formed part of that. And that ran successfully from 1936 until it was sold by the department in 1960. So it was sold off and the land was auctioned. In 1973, the Glamorgan Heritage Coast Project was established, and they begin doing conservation work and landscaping work and access improvement work all up and down the Heritage Coast. And in particular, they begin to have some involvement in this area of the world by here. They negotiated the establishment of the car park that was just down to the bottom, and also worked with the then owner to maintain the grounds at Summerhouse. In 1986, the Sea-Watch Centre opened. That's immediately just to the west of the promontory fort. And that was attracting large visitor numbers throughout its life, and for the rest of the period that we might be interested in this application. So it's a very brief sort of whiz through the timeline of what was going on at the bottom of Llantwit Major and this area in particular at that time. But we'll come on to look at the evidence in a little bit more detail now. So first of all, just to take the user evidence first, and if you can move on to the next slide, if that's not already happened. So user evidence, the initial call for user evidence that went out as part of the application saw 32 user evidence forms submitted, and that seemed to describe use from about 1936 onwards. There was a few details in them where they were either completed in part only or lacked dates or were non-specific. But the general picture that you get from these user evidence forms is that from that period, you had prolonged use by foot, cycle, and also by motor vehicle. And that was all principally associated with either recreation or access to the facilities that were at the end of the track. So the Havard, the Sea-Watch Centre, or indeed just recreational use down to the beach. So the nature of use was challenged when during sort of conversion of the barns at Boverton Mill in 2007. So that is when we were talking earlier about demonstration of intention not to dedicate routes or people being challenged on the routes, then we've got a clear indication of that having happened in 2007. But there's no indication of any challenge prior to that period that's being made out. I will mention here as well that following the initial assessment of the application, then there were a number of other user evidence forms that were submitted and statements that were submitted. They are sort of dealt with and picked up later on in the report, where we're having a look at the analysis of how the road traffic might fit together. So that's the user evidence, or a very brief summary thereof. Obviously, the user evidence you can see in the investigation report and a slightly more detailed description of how it plays out in there. Moving on to the documentary evidence that supports this. So there is an awful lot of documentary evidence that goes into this particular case. And we'll start with the estate map for Edward Rose Tund from 1817, and you can see the route of the track in there as it's leading down to the Summerhouse at the bottom, and it's shown in the same terms as the rest of the track, to be honest. Features that to draw people's attention to on this map, which are common features really to an awful lot of the other maps that we're going to quickly go through. you can see that the fields have been numbered, and that the routes and the tracks themselves have been left unnumbered. That's one of the things that we tend to look for to try to determine if that is supportive of a route being public or not, because generally where there is nobody claiming private ownership of a field, or it's not looking like it's enclosed, then it's indicative of it being sort of like maintained or accepted to be usable by the public at large, rather than one particular person or landowner. So on this map, you've got all the numbered fields that have been shown on there, and the unnumbered tracks that you can see on there. They all seem to follow the routes that are now recorded as public. I mean, not the case for all the routes shown, but a large majority of them are. As mentioned, there's no distinction between the route that we're looking at, A to B, in its northern extent. It all looks like one road on this map. And Bovton Mill Farm is shown segregated from the track, whereas now it's kind of spawning around it. So that's the one from 1817. Boverton Estate, which is the next slide. You can see it in similar terms, a little bit more colourful perhaps, and many of the same things apply. You can see the field patterns where the fields are numbered. The roads themselves are not so much. There is a schedule that goes along with this map. I mean, it's actually a set of 3 maps. You can see them all in the investigation report, and this is just an excerpt of the latest one that you can see on the screen there. But within the schedule, then they list a parcel, number 61, as roads and waste. And actually, if you go through the map, then the maps, there is no number 61 listed on any of the field patterns. So perhaps speculating then that 61 is relating to all of the sections that aren't included within the fields, and all of those tracks are shown ochre, and consistent with other routes that are also public highways at the moment. The next slide, then, please. So within the investigation report, then you'll see excerpts from Lantwick Major highway accounts and the court leap books. They're quite difficult to read in places, just simply because of because they're all handwritten. So to guide you a little bit on the important things that are included within that evidence, you can see evidence of the highway surveyor at the time making payments for hauling stones from Summerhouse prior to 1845, breaking and filling stones on Boverton Farm Road in 1845, making payments in respect of Boverton Farm Road, making payment for the maintenance of 11 perches of road near Summerhouse, and references to having taken 1 load of stones from the beach at Boverton, repair of the road to the beach. So you've got very strong and good evidence in there that the road was being maintained. Obviously, the entire track, including the section to the top that's accepted to be a adopted highway, could be referred to as Boverton Farm Road. But we posit that because they're making references to the Summerhouse and the road near Summerhouse in there, it's likely that they're also talking about the section A to B that we're interested in. So there seems to be some clear evidence in there that during the 19th century, the road was being maintained at public expense. The next slide relates to the tithe map and apportionment in 1842. Again, you've got the track on there. It's clearly not assigned a field number, but if you follow it through, it does run into field 827. Actually, the tithe and apportionment, that covers both mapping and a schedule that goes along with it. And if you look at the schedule and what it says for 827, then you can see that it covers 9 acres and 30 perches. And if you then go and measure that, that seems to be the area covered by the field only, and excludes that track. So that seems to be supportive of it not being considered part of that field, and therefore supportive of the track being in more sort of common use and not associated with a private individual that might then be paying tithes on that particular bit. Moving through to the mid 1800s, we've got a series of ordnance survey maps. Really, the headlines for these is that you can see the track was obviously in situ throughout the 19th century. It's there running down to the Sum House in much the same condition that it is at the moment. And you can see that on that first slide, which runs 1868 to 1890 and 1885. And also on the next slide, if we move on to that, which are a bit higher scale. So 1897 and 1900. And you can see the track being a very sort of clear, formalised track running down to the Sum House in each of those pieces of evidence as well. The next map is the Bartholomew series from 1904. So this was quite a popular series, particularly for use for recreation. They were quite influential at the time, sold well with like cyclists and tourists. And that is picking up this route running all the way down to the Summer House. And again, there's no distinction really between the bottom end of that track and the top end. It's running sort of straight down to the bottom. Further ordnance survey maps on the next slide is in 1919 and 1921, showing much the same things as before. You can see that this track was obviously in situ, bounded by enclosed boundaries, which suggests that established hedges or other boundary features were running down alongside it. At this point, you can start to see where they're referring to an old lime kiln just to the east of the camp, and also the location of the pier. So this track sort of ran down and ultimately went and served the pier for a little while during the previous century. The next slide shows the 1941 edition of Bartholomew map. That couches the route in much the same terms as the previous ones. The Bartholomew maps were periodically updated, and this route seems to have appeared in the same manner in all of them. On to later ordnance survey maps round about the start and mid 20th century, and you can see that they're consistent with earlier editions describing a distinct track south of Bobden Mill Farm buildings. The OS 1948 colour edition, however, that includes additional detail over that of the others in the series, so it provides annotation on it that's descriptive of the character of routes. And within that, A to B can be seen as coloured as a continuation of the highway that's leading from Bobden Mill Farm, and in a manner described by the key that's associated with the map as an other road with a good or metalled surface. So that's the one in the bottom right corner of the slide, and you can see that the orange dashes continue all the way down to the summer house, which looks like it's indicating on that it was observed on the ground as having a metalled surface, so a sealed surface. The picture remains largely the same with ordnance survey maps as they run through the 1960s and into the 1970s. You can begin to see and pick up the Havard Girls Camp at the bottom. You can particularly see that on the one that's shown on the right-hand side, as there's more buildings demonstrated on the map just down by there. And then by the time we get to the Ordnance Survey maps in 1997, this is now post the Glamorgan Heritage Coast project starting and the negotiation of a licence for the car park at the bottom. And you can see that that car park is listed there with a big P sign. Havard Girls Camp, that opened in 1932. We've got various photographs of the activities that were happening in and around the girls' camp and what it looked like. So I've picked out that photo there as a demonstration of that. You can see that a variety of outdoor activities were being undertaken around about that time. And the only means of access down to that camp was through the route A to B that we're talking about there. The parish survey map we will talk about very, very quickly. So in 1949, the National Parks and Access to the Countryside Act came in, and that required effectively the establishment of definitive maps. So previously there were no maps that legally recorded where public rights of way went. And the 1949 Act introduced the requirement on authorities to do that. And as part of the process, the very first stage of the process were parish surveys, where surveyors, parish by parish, went out to all of the little communities, little parishes at the time, and tried to survey and log where they thought the routes went. So this is the parish survey map that was undertaken for Lantwick Major. That happened in 1951, and that was part of efforts to establish that first definitive map. So as you can see, then the route was left blank from A to B. You've got colouring from Boverton Farm running north, which is all coloured up yellow. That seems to be consistent with some of the other routes that are now identified as adopted highways. So we might sort of speculate that the shading represents the extent of the roads networks, although the precise intention is always unclear, because these were parish maps that were intended to record where public rights of way were only. What we can say from that map, though, is that at that time they weren't recording it as a public right of way. The reasons for that might have been that they thought it was a higher status or a different status that shouldn't appear on the definitive map, or it might have been that they just didn't think it was public in any way. We can only really speculate. Particulars, plans and conditions of sale for Boverton. So this is where we were talking about the Special Areas Act, and when Boverton Place Farm was brought into that in 1936. This is the sale of that estate in 1960, and there weren't maps that were accompanying it, so that makes it a little bit imprecise to interpret. But some of the text seems to be fairly on point. So in particular, it refers to a county council road maintained regularly by the council running from Boverton to Boverton Mill Farm. Thus, in that document, it refers to it stopping short of the route A to B. That's the road itself. It sells lot 1, subject to a private right in favour of the owners of OS 969 through Boverton Farm, which it refers to as commencing at the point that the public highway terminates. And so there's clear reference to the termination of public highway rights at Boverton Farm, and implies that access beyond that termination point was not recognised in the same terms. Everything that they write in there seems to say that the public highway rights come down to Boverton Mill Farm, and then the route that we're interested in, A to B, for whatever reason, they didn't think was public at that point. The Glamorgan Heritage Coast initiatives, as I say, they were established, and they set about negotiating improved access down to Summerhouse Point, and the introduction of a car park. And as part of those efforts, then they arranged a license. In fact, they arranged 2, one in 1976 that ran for 5 years, and a later one in 1982 that continued it. So these licenses extended the private rights of the trustees of what was now the Christian Camp, is formerly the Havard Girls Camp, to the public for all forms of user. So that's vehicle, foot, cycling, bridleway, everything over that track. And there's some evidence that public access existed during the 1976 to 1987 period, therefore, on the basis of a license rather than as of right. As I was saying at the start, one of the criteria for looking at whether people can acquire a right by continuous use is that it needs to be without permission. And the existence of a license, if it's sufficiently communicated to the public and they know that's what they're doing, or there's been attempts to do that, would be something that would frustrate their ability to acquire a right, because it's a revocable permission rather than using it as if you had a right. So on to the next slide, and you can see that the car park that was established, that was subject of a planning application. The main interest in things in looking at the planning application is perhaps in talking about the nature of the use and what was going on there at the time. So it's referring to a rough track acting as a deterrent to tourists. But it does acknowledge considerable local demand for access to the beach, continuous use by locals and fishermen, and it refers to including problems caused by parking motor vehicles on verges and within the fine confines of the Havard. So there was obviously significant use at this time, including by motor vehicle, albeit that it was supported by a time-limited permissive agreement, and that. As we move on to the next slide, we can see was also being communicated to the public. So the Glamorgan Heritage Coast, they produced a review and a statement, and they talk about that was publicly published, and they talk about the access agreement that was negotiated in there. So the work to establish the access agreements, including sort of plans with further goals to improve access further. So, as I say, this was being communicated through that review, and also on the next slide, or on sort of slides further down, it was being communicated by leaflets to the public as well, actually. The Sea-Watch Centre, this is notable mostly because it was a significant facility that people were trying to access. It's down at Summerhouse Point, A to B's primary means of accessing the facility. When this was established, then you're talking about really, really significant visitor numbers. 3,617 school children visited the centre in 1990 and 91, and they were being bussed down. So obviously a big draw, and the only means of access to it effectively was by travelling along A to B. That centre continued to be promoted as an education centre during the decades that followed, and beyond the 2007 challenge to user that we were talking about earlier as well. The next slide, briefly. Lantwick Major, aspects of its history. I'll give a mention to this because it's been a very, very useful source by Lantwick Major History Society, particularly in relation to some of the more ancient practices that were going on down at the Summerhouse, and significantly talks about the appeal by Mr. Sayes to the manorial court in 1730 to declare the road leading to the Summerhouse as out of repair. So, having seen that in the History Society's research, and we've obviously gone and tried to find primary evidence of that, but despite looking in the court rolls in the National Library for Wales and also the Glamorgan Archives, been unable to find it. So the exact terms that it was made out under, we've not been able to pick up. But we will say that the other information that is included within that text all seems to be good and that is corroboratable. So in particular, the references to how the road was maintained during the 19th century, they're all substantiated by looking at the private record books that we were talking about earlier. On to the next slide, and these are the leaflets that we were talking about. So Glamorgan Heritage Coast produce public-facing leaflets that they push out and advertise, partly, well, mostly to do with interpretation of the ancient history of the Summerhouse Point. But they also make it apparent to the public that the area is owned by a trust and that access is provided to them to the public at large on a permissive basis. So they put these licenses in place, and then they've also communicated that to the public. So it's just a further instance, really, of the effect of the licence being published out there. Within the investigation report, you will find a couple of other details of documentary evidence, which we'll just briefly sort of talk about, really. There's reports by the Coast Guard of use of the track in more recent years, and they cover the period of 2014 to 2018. They are mostly logs of search and rescue missions where they've needed to access the track in order to go and conduct their business. And also, you can see that you probably see it now, websites that are promoting recreational use of the destination, and they refer to the facilities at the southern end of A to B. So thus that would be the means of access to it, and the use would be public use for recreational purposes. In 2007, there was a challenge to use, and that is documented. There was a message that was sent to the local authority by the Ramblers Association, where a member of the Ramblers was challenged by the landowner up next to Boverton Mill Farm. So that represents a challenge and would interrupt use for the purposes of the Highways Act Section 31. So all of that evidence is obviously in the investigation report, and you can go and have a look at the quite extensive appendices if you want to be able to see them in more detail and interrogate them there. But to try to give you a bit of a sense of how I'm suggesting all of that comes together, then the case assessment, if we move on to that. So the academic sources, they're providing really interesting insight into the ancient activity around the area, and the early construction of that promontory fort obviously left a significant mark on the landscape. And that then gets repurposed throughout the subsequent ages. Construction of the Coney Warren gives the first indication of modern use of Summerhouse Point. By implication, then there's a necessity for a means to access it. So that's probably the first point at which we're looking at modern use of the track running up and down there, particularly as that is round about the same time as the fields start to be enclosed. So we can speculate that the provision of that cottage at the time when those field patterns were being formalised might have informed the layout of the road as it is now. But I mean, there's also obviously very little hard evidence from around about that time. Development of the summer house, including incorporation of that cottage, that seems to have given further purpose to the need to access the point. The academic investigation by the History Society looks like it's uncovered indication that the dedication of the track within court rolls, so that it should be maintainable at public expense. And whilst we haven't been able to see that in person, it's unclear as to the specific terms and the extent to which the dedication was clearly expressed, but the History Society do appear to have found that in their own research when they were looking at it. Later records demonstrate that acts of maintenance were being carried out on behalf of the public at large throughout the mid to late 1800s. Those records are referring to Boverton Farm Road, Mill Road, and also to roads near the summer house. And by that time, Ordnance Survey mapping was also available and capturing the route of that path. A road was shown on the maps progressing south from Boverton Mill Farm through to Summerhouse during the 19th century. That also lends support to the idea that the route described by the record books incorporated A to B. Also, further, I mean, the record books refer to the hauling of stone from the beach near the Summerhouse within the same record book that section A to B was in use for the local surveyor. Which obviously would have required a more formalised route capable of supporting the kind of traffic that you need to be able to haul stone. So the activities and mapping, like throughout the 19th century, show the track A to B, and they appear to support the position that the route was accepted as public in 1730 and publicly maintained throughout the following century. So that's the position pre-1930s, and I think to make clear, then I think what that adds up to is that probably prior to the 1930s, it looks as if the route had already been established as a public way from the evidence that we've had there. From 1936 onwards, whilst this is, if be able to accept that, this is somewhat immaterial, but we'll give a description of it anyway. Really, really strong user evidence indicating the track was in use by members of the public on foot and also by vehicle from 1936. And that was often for the purposes of recreation, either associated with visits to the Harvard camp or other facilities that were down at the end of the track. Some of the visits might bear the characteristics of use on the basis of private rights, such as camp attendees accessing the property by invitation to carry out business at the camp, but it doesn't seem to have been limited to those purposes, and the user evidence suggests that locals would attend the camp from time to time, and users also report following the track for access to the beach around about then as well. Use from 1936 seemed to continue in a manner consistent with the earlier dedication of the route prior to the acquisition of it of the land by the Crown. So once it's been acquired by the Crown in 1936, then that appears to have given rise to a belief. I mean, certainly amongst those that were later sort of selling the property, that public rights extended only so far as to Boverton Farm. The parish survey of 1951 gives some indication of the road north of Boverton Mill Farm being shown in similar terms as the rest of the public road network, and distinguished from the route to the south. It should be noted, however, that footpath 3 linking to point B of the application route was identified on the plan and remains unchanged today. So drafting that footpath 3 so that it just kind of stops at the end of a linear route is a bit peculiar. And a belief that A to B carried higher rights might offer a more rational explanation for not continuing it along the track. Sale of the land in 1960 included clear indication that public rights terminated at the farm and reserved private rights for holdings accessed by the track. The reason for the change in understanding is pretty unclear, particularly given that user evidence forms are submitted by employees of the Land Settlement Association at the time, or those involved in the preparation of the 1960 sales document and who claim that the track is properly public. But no further evidence has been uncovered from the archive that would appear to imply pre-existing rights were stopped up as a result of acquisition by the Land Settlement Association. So it doesn't look as if they bought the land and then did a legal order to get rid of any existing public rights. It's just for whatever reason, they came to be of the belief that the public rights didn't exist on that section. A to B looks like it was within Crown ownership as a result of its acquisition associated with the Land Settlement Act from 1934, and that ran from 1936 until 1960. So the fact that it's within Crown ownership is significant to us when we're examining this period. So the royal prerogative undermines the basis on which rights can normally be acquired under the Highways Act. So when we were talking about the tests that you do to see whether a route is public or not, that first section that had all the different criteria, the 20 years use, the interruption, all of that, doesn't apply to land that's owned by the Crown because the Crown can decide that it's exempt from that element of the Highways Act. So as this was owned by the Crown, 1936 to 1960, that makes it difficult to establish rights on that basis during that period. It's clear that significant public use was continuing. Provision of a car park and access rights along A to B were negotiated subject to a licence later on, which was made apparent to the public within those published reviews and the interpretation leaflets. So from 1936 onwards, there's some technical difficulties, or there would be technical difficulties in looking at whether public rights could have been established at that point, because you've got a 20-year period between the sale of the land from the Crown. So obviously, whilst the land's owned by the Crown, it's quite difficult to establish the rights. The 20-year period from the sale of the land from the Crown and the beginning of the licence, and the licence obviously also makes it difficult to acquire rights, is not completed. The licence expires in 1987, so the next 20-year period that could be considered ends in 2007, and at that time, the council are getting a clear indication that users were being challenged on the route, which again just clips into the tail end of a 20-year period and would make it very difficult to acquire rights under the Highways Act. So there's barriers to acquisition of public rights from 1936 onwards. However, that's likely immaterial because it looks like prior to 1930, like throughout the 18th century, the road was being maintained at public expense. It had already been accepted that it was public, and those rights probably already existed. And the idea that they were private when the Land Settlement Act came in looks like it was probably a bit of an anomaly. So at this point, then we're looking at rights having been established prior to 1930 and it looking like it's public. If we move on to the next slide, which is about the assessment of the route status, then this is where the secondary question comes in, because this application was submitted requesting a footpath. And now it's the duty of the council to investigate these applications when it comes in and come up with the right answer, rather than simply look at what the application sets out initially. And so it's appropriate for the council to try to work out what the actual correct status is. So it's been posited that the motivation for appealing to the manorial court in 1730 might have been informed by the desire to improve the route to a condition suitable for horses and carriages. And whilst there's no primary evidence in favour of that, we couldn't find the appeal in the court rolls. The wide enclosed track that appears to have remained broadly consistent in character within the historical mapping seems to be supportive of that idea. References within the highways engineers' records books to the haulage of stone from the beach along the track, the improvement of the surface, and mapping evidence of its service of a pier on the beach that was being used to transport lime. Also, all lends weight to it having been quite a substantial track that was carrying like serious traffic. So it lends weight to the idea that the track's been used and maintained for carriages and carts. So that brings us to the idea that these days it might be at least a restricted byway, which is a way that allows you to walk, cycle, take your horses, and also a horse and cart. It looks like it was probably established in those terms. The user evidence submitted isn't only limited to foot, it also includes pedal cycle, and also there's quite a lot talking about mechanically propelled vehicles, so cars and motor vehicles and buses, throughout the time that's covered by the user evidence forms from 1936 onwards. Use by these motor vehicles in particular has given rise to a question as to whether the track should actually correctly be considered a county road and therefore not recorded on the definitive map at all, because it's of a higher status. And this is what brings us back to the Natural Environment and Rural Communities Act, which is detailed on the next slide. That's it. So, Natural Environment and Rural Communities Act 2006, that extinguished all unrecorded public rights for mechanically propelled vehicles in the country. And that's probably a bit of a weird thing to imagine the government wholesale doing. So to provide a little bit of context as to what was going on at this time, around about then, prior to 2006, lots of problems with people usually perhaps off-roaders that were driving along footpaths or bridleways or routes that were completely unrecorded. And whilst it was an offence to drive your motor vehicle somewhere other than a road or on a footpath or on a bridleway, generally what would happen is enforcement bodies, usually a local authority or perhaps somebody else with those enforcement powers would attempt to prosecute people for doing it. And the response would be, well, yes, it's recorded as a footpath, but actually I've got unrecorded vehicular rights. They do exist. It's just that that they're not logged anywhere, and we now need to go through a process to establish, that we don't, or you need to go through a process to establish that actually there isn't, and there never have been unrecorded vehicular rights on there, which made it quite difficult to take any form of enforcement, and effectively made it very, very difficult to protect some of the more delicate routes. So in order to address that, the Natural Environment Rural Communities Act came in, and it said that anything that hasn't already been recorded and isn't sort of formally recognised anywhere, that gets extinguished, and it disappears, and you lose those rights. Obviously, that's quite a big move. So that was done subject to a number of criteria. So a number of exceptions to the Act to try to make sure, basically, that routes that were part of the ordinary road network, or that were that properly should contain motorised vehicle rights, were picked up. And those criteria were as shown on the slide there. So the first one, in fact, I'll come back to A. So run through B to E first of all. So B, which was immediately before the Act came in, that it was not shown in definitive map and statement, but was shown as in the list of streets. Well, in the case of A to B, it wasn't shown in the list of street in the definitive map, and it also wasn't shown in the list of streets. So B doesn't get triggered. So C, it was created by an enactment or instrument or otherwise on terms that expressly provided for it to be used by motor vehicles. Well, that's not the case here. I mean, we know that this route existed from probably the 15th century onwards. I mean, certainly 1700s or so. So C wouldn't be triggered either. D, created by the construction and exercise of powers conferred by virtue of any enactment of a road intended to be used by such vehicles. Local authorities have got powers under the Highways Act to go and create roads by building them, and if they do, they automatically become public maintainable at public expense. This track, as I say, the existence of that preceded any of those powers, and the point at which it was created, motor vehicles didn't exist. So D also doesn't get triggered. And then E, it was created by virtue of such use by vehicles during a period ending before 1st of December 1930. That's quite a hard one to establish for any route, really, because motorised vehicles in the UK didn't get popularised until 1930, or the early 1930s, which is probably why they chose that date. We've got lots and lots of evidence about motor vehicles being used post the establishment of the Havard in 1932, but nothing really prior to that. So E also doesn't get triggered. So we come back to point A, and if we move on to the next slide. I'm sorry. Well, that's the correct slide. Yeah. So remaining criteria in A is what we're looking at, and that requires that the main lawful use by the public between the 16th of November 2001 and 16th of November 2006 be by mechanically propelled vehicle, and that main lawful use is very deliberately stated. So just use by the track by mechanically propelled vehicles at all obviously doesn't rise to its main use being by vehicles. So that's also very important in terms of the definition of byways open to all traffic, which is something that I mentioned earlier, as they are highways over which the public have got a right for vehicles and also all other kinds of traffic, but they're mainly used for the purposes for which footpaths and bridleways are so used. So the only criteria that triggers is where you're not looking at a boat, a byway open to all traffic, where you're looking at a higher status road that is used by vehicles more than it is used by people on foot or by pedal cycle. So Natural Environment Rules Communities Act 2006 therefore have the effect of extinguishing vehicle rights associated with an unrecorded boat if it wasn't already included in the exceptions in B2E, which it doesn't look like they were. So how do you then go about determining what the main public use of that route was during the 5 years before this Act kicks in? So the appropriate way to do it is to go back to the user evidence forms that have been submitted and have a look at those, which moves us on to the next slide. So initially, upon receipt of this application, 32 user evidence forms were received, and they covered 33 users, and that was submitted in support of the application. However, following that, oops, sorry, I moved my slides around. However, following consultation on the initial investigation report, 171 statements attesting to use of the track were received, and these were by and large in the form of a templated response that was obviously part of a local campaign. So, went and had a look at those in a lot more detail. So, of the 171 received, 162 were following a standard template. And the statement that was included in it was that the people submitting them used the track to walk and drive to the car park at Summerhouse Point. There was no further information on the frequency of use or indication of the frequency by user type. And on the remaining 9 that did deviate from that template, then 4 didn't extend to use during the 5 years period that we're interested in, we're looking at. 2 indicated more frequent use on foot than by car, and 3 didn't provide sufficient detail on frequency by user type to determine what the main use was. So those 171 statements, whilst it obviously reflects an awful lot of public feeling and opinion, the vast majority of them referred to walking and driving. So that doesn't tip the balance in favour of driving. You can't really determine that the main use was by driving rather than walking from that. And of the ones that didn't follow that standard template that just balanced those frequencies of use out, the weight probably was more in favour of walking rather than driving. As those weren't very helpful, then user evidence forms were offered to everybody that submitted the statements, and those were sent out to try to gather more information and get a slightly more reliable assessment of the main use. From that, 25 further user evidence forms were submitted, and that's in addition to the 33 users, it was 32 forms, but 33 users who initially responded. One user submitting an evidence form both initially and prior to consultation. So that made the total number of distinct users, therefore 57. So next slide, and going on to trying to look at how that balances out and working out what the main use was. So 45 of the users reported use of the track either throughout the 5 years preceding commencement of NERC or during part of that period. So the 5 years that we're looking at, 2001 to 2006, to enable it to fall within the exception and not be extinguished. Of those 45 users, 39 of them reported use on foot, 10 by use on pedal cycle, and 36 by use on car. So 6 of the forms were only completed in part, and if we were to discount those, then the numbers look more like 35 on foot, 10 by pedal cycle, and 31 by car. So trying to summarise that in a little bit of a table with a visual indication of, for each frequency, which form of access is highest, which is second, and which is third. So red doesn't mean that they weren't doing it like that; just means that's the lowest frequency of use according to that category. And so visually, as you can see, foot and pedal cycle users, well, the predominant use was on foot. The secondary use was by car in most cases, and the tertiary use was by pedal cycle. But particularly when you're looking at the frequency of use, then foot exceeds the motor vehicle use earlier on. Move on to the next slide. So from that, you can see that numerous users were attesting to multiple forms of use. And for those that cover the 5-year period prior to commencement of the Act, 44 of them provide an indication of their frequency of use by user type. So 21 users indicated non-vehicular use more frequently than by vehicle. 18 users indicated use by vehicle and non-vehicle at a similar frequency, and 5 users indicated use of a vehicle more frequently than by non-vehicle. So in our assessment of what the main use of the route was it by vehicle or was it by footpath or pedal cycle, then it looks like there's a large skew in favour of by foot and by pedal cycle. So it doesn't look like from that the main use was by vehicle, albeit we acknowledge that motor vehicles were using it and they were using it in significant numbers. Notably, the user evidence forms received post-consultation, and which were invited from the 171 statements that received, 20 described use during the 5-year period leading up to commencement of NERC, and of those, 7 users indicated non-vehicle use more frequently than by vehicle, 10 users indicated use both by vehicle and non-vehicle at similar frequency, and only 3 stated that they used it by vehicle more frequently than non-vehicle, and obviously that was evidence that was coming off the back of a campaign that looked like it was more targeted at saying this was a road. So there was clearly substantial vehicle use during the 2001 to 2006 period, and indeed from 1936 onwards. However, the evidence that we're looking at seems to support its main use as a footpath or bridleway, and therefore our suggestion is that the criteria in A that would allow these rights not to be extinguished does not appear to be met. So that's the next slide, and you can see there, just wrapping that up, the totality and frequency of use by user type doesn't seem to support the main use of the track by public motor vehicles. And so if unrecorded rights for motor vehicles had been established during 1936 to onwards, then it looks like they failed to meet any exception that was in that Act of Parliament that was passed in 2006, and as a result they were extinguished in 2006. So it's a bit of an open question as to whether motor vehicle rights had come into existence, but if they had, then it certainly looks like they were extinguished in 2006 from our assessment of the evidence. So finally, in conclusion, it looks like the route was likely to become maintainable at public expense in 1730. It was certainly subsequently maintained at public expense throughout the 19th century. It looks like whilst there's technical complications to rights being acquired and dedicated post-1936, they're by and large immaterial, as there's strong evidence in favour that those rights had already been established prior to that period. Public motor vehicle rights may or may not have been established, but as there's no exception within the Act of Parliament that came in 2006 that's applicable on the current evidence, then it looks like if they were, the effect of the Natural Environment and Rural Communities Act would have been to extinguish them, and therefore don't believe that it's a road with motor vehicle rights. As such, the recommendation for this particular application is to make a definitive map modification order, and that should be couched in terms of recording the route as a restricted byway. And that, you'll be glad to know, brings me to the end of the investigation report.
Thank you very much, Gwyn. Gareth, I need to be guided by you now. I think we move now on to public speakers.
Yeah, so the order is, Chair, because Councillor Gwyn John is a Vale Morgan councillor, and the other public speaker is supporting the application, so that the public speaker will go last. So it's Councillor Gwyn John next, or any Vale councillor, then it's on to the public speaker. Okay. Okie
doke, thank you very much. In that case, Councillor John.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Firstly, thank you, Gwyn, very much for that fantastic report that you've just given us. I don't agree with all of it, but I accept that you have left gaps, that it is open to public discussion. I am objecting to the recommendation to make this a public highway. I class this as still a public highway, as it goes back in history to a public highway. You want to make this a footpath 3 meters wide, not to be used by vehicles. It's clear from the history and the evidence of this report that this road is an unclassified public highway, similar to the road at the bottom of Clew Street in Lantwit down to Lantwit Beach. Was built by local people in the 18th century. And I think this is probably very similar, that this developed, although there's loads of evidence that you put together today, which I do accept. But South Glamorgan County Council, under the guidership of Dr. Howden, put that application in for a car park because of the need for a car park for the number of vehicles going down this road. And the emphasis of Section 67 on the NERC 2006 Act, I read that not as a public highway action, but a public right-of-way. Cars going across a public right-of-way were included in that. Now, this is a difference between a public highway and a public right-of-way. I'm really concerned. Obviously, the person that lives in the family that live in Woodlands at some house point, they would have right of access down there, surely, as they have vehicles driving to their home. On top of that, what about their visitors driving, deliveries, driving? I mean, member of the public driving down Mill Road sees a vehicle ahead of them going down that road, down to Summerhouse Point. Who's going to stop them going down there? I mean, quite honestly, you've got farmers still go down there with their tractors. I mean, there's a number of other people, like there's fishermen still go down there fishing. Beaverton Beach is a popular area for fishermen. So I guess you expect them to park up at Mill Barn and walk down. Now, I can't really see that happening, because if you get a lot of cars down there parking out Mill Barn, that's where you're going to get the resident living there, kicking up absolute hell. And I can see, quite honestly, huge problems with the Summerhouse Bay Action Group, which have been very active in objecting to no vehicles going down this public highway ever since this report was written in the very beginning. Personally, I think that there are going to be huge problems objecting to vehicles going down and making it only for public footpath. I can think that there's certainly going to be confrontation in the future. I am objecting to the plans simply because of the history of this site and the fact of my lifetime, how much I remember about it. And quite simply, it'll take a number of years where my generations disappear for it to be accepted by future generations. I think there's too much history behind this to exclude vehicle rights. And quite honestly, I just hope that people don't get into confrontation with owners of houses off Mill Road in the future, because I can see big, big problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Gwyn. Are there any points of clarification from members of the committee on what Gwyn has just been talking about?
Chair, I can see Councillor Drake has her hand up and has had for some time.
Yes. Councillor Drake, is this a point of
No, I
clarification?
just wanted to ask Gwyn Teague, what is the average width of this footpath, please? I don't want to know the length, I want to know the width of it.
Chair, we'll come back in the main debate.
I think we come back to that after the speakers Pam. Emma,
That's fine. Thank you.
Emma, you have your hand up.
Thanks, Chair. I'd just like to show my support, and I agree with Councillor John. I recently went down the road and I was greeted with this is a private road sign, and I needed to access the bottom. There was a car park there for me to drive down to. And I don't think you should restrict access to that point for the public by any means. And looking at the history, I actually see the report as it shouldn't be restricted. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Emma, for your contribution. Gareth, there being no other points of clarification, I believe we move now on to the public speaker in favour, who is Mr. Powell.
That's correct. Yeah, David Powell. If you can come on screen, Mr. Powell. Yeah, and
Welcome, Mr. Powell. You've been briefed on public speakers and so on, so it starts when you start.
Okay. Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, everybody. I'd like to point out I'm speaking as an individual town councillor and not speaking on behalf of Atlantic Major Town Council. I'm a councillor, but not speaking on behalf of the town council. I'm in favour of joining footpath 55 and the footpath 3 in order to obtain a legal right of way from Mill Farm to the Some House Point. This has been the objective of Atlantic Major Town Council since 2007, when local residents were first confronted with a landowner and told they were walking over private land. It's taken 16 years of compiling evidence and negotiations to get where we are today, and hence my support for the application. Several alternative routes have been investigated over the years with landowners, but without any success. The only option left is to follow the existing roadway leading to the beach. The footpath would also create an additional option to get to the Welsh coastal path. A massive amount of information has been gathered by Atlantic Major Town Council and supplied to the Vale Council officers as evidence to prove that public right of way has been to the beach for hundreds of years. We've already seen that in Gwyn Teague's report, a massive amount of evidence. There's no doubt that the access has been used by people, as he said, walking, riding and driving for many, many generations without any obstruction or confrontation until in recent years when the land has been registered to private ownership. On the request of local residents, an application was submitted in 2015 to create footpath 61. This is footpath 61, and the parish of Atlantic Major to join the two footpaths 55 and 3. A footpath would be created along what was considered at the time a private track. This went to subcommittee and the Rights of Way Committee in 2016, where it was proposed and supported by Atlantic Major Vale councillors, local MP, Ramblers Association, and hundreds of residents. Yes, in 2018, a definitive map modification order was applied by Atlantic Major Town Council on the advice of the Vale Footpaths Officer, I was Gwyn Teague at the time, the documents providing legal conclusive proof and existence of and location of a public right-of-way. The documents provided were not to try and obtain a new right-of-way, but to prove a right-of-way exists. In my opinion, and I hope in saying this, the creation of a footpath along the road will not interfere with the vehicle access to private residents living at the end of the road, any development of that site, or to the private car park. It's never been Atlantic Major's opinion to stop vehicles from going down that path. The original application was for a footpath so people could walk down uninterrupted. I've personally walked down Boveton Beach since the 1970s without any problems, but residents deserve to be able to walk this ancient route without being obstructed or put in danger by the landowners who object them crossing their private land. Totally agree with what Councillor John has said. We don't want confrontation going down to down to Boveton Beach.
that's 3 minutes, Chair.
For support. Sorry.
That's 3 minutes.
Oh, apologies. Again, apologies for going over what Gwyn Teague has already said. But thanks for letting me speak, and really appreciate that my support for getting the public footpath down to the beach. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Bell. If you just stay on screen for a moment to see if there's any points of clarification from any members of the committee. If anyone has any points of clarification, I see no hands. In that case, Gwyn, if you would like to come back on, Gwyn Teague, that is, would like to come back on to address the points raised by the two speakers.
Yeah, sure. I'll try and pick it up as best I can. So for me, the first thing to highlight is that this is a definitive map modification order application. And so the committee are quite restricted in how they're able to approach it. It's sort of settled law, if you like, that what you're trying to do here is assess what rights the public might have already brought into existence by their historic use of it or by what's gone on in the past. So you are not allowed to take into account antisocial behaviour, whether or not it's a good idea to create a route, because you're not creating a route, you're just looking at whether or not the rights have already been established. So as much as it might be desirable to bring that into, whether or not you make an order, restricted from doing it because that's not the terms of the application that you're trying to deal with. There are other mechanisms that councils can use in order to create a public highway if they think that it's desirable to do so. But this process is just looking at whether or not the public, by historical use, have already acquired that or not, and what the impacts of that might be are unable to be taken into account. So that would be the main points to guide the committee on. A couple of people have talked about this in terms of a footpath. I think the recommendation is for a restricted byway, which is obviously slightly higher status and would also cover pedal cycles and any non-motorised vehicle use. And I think the other thing to probably say is to pick up on Councillor John's point and the motorised vehicle use of the route. I think that if we'd been having this conversation in 2005, then it might be a very different conversation. Clearly, there has been an awful lot of motorised vehicle use. There might very well be have been a good case for deciding that motorised vehicle use had been established. I mean, it has the look of a byway open to all traffic, and I don't doubt that people have been using motorised vehicles on it. Albeit that the foot and pedal cycle has been used more. However, the effect of Natural Environment and Rural Communities Act was that that was extinguished. Those unrecorded vehicle rights were extinguished. And so that puts us in the position where we are, really. Public rights of way and highways are both the same thing, albeit different classifications when it comes to the law. So I think that's probably what I would say from my point of view.
Thank you, Gwyn. Have any members of the committee got any questions now for Gwyn, please? Councillor Bruce. Councillor Bruce.
I'm a bit confused. Are there houses there with vehicle access?
Gwyn?
Yeah, so perhaps that's another thing that I can clarify. So the Natural Environment Rural Communities Act, when that came in, all public vehicle rights were extinguished. However, there was in a separate section that we haven't dealt with because we're looking at public rights, not private rights, and how they're supported. Then where private individuals might have been relying on public vehicle rights in order to drive down to their houses, then NERC provided them with a private vehicular right to continue accessing their properties, whether they were already doing that or whether it was something that they might have needed to do in the future. So yes, there was a property at the bottom and there might well have been, the Sea Watch Centre might have also fallen into this category. There might be private means of access down to there, but those rights would have been retained when NERC came in and extinguished any public rights.
So to clarify, the people who live in those houses down the end can drive their cars down what would be a
to clarify,
restricted byway.
Yeah, they would have acquired a private right that's just for them rather than for everyone in the world. To be able to,
Then their delivery drivers, their friends and family.
that's right.
could
Yeah,
access their properties.
anyone that they're inviting down to it, then it is also covered by that.
Thank you very much for that. Does that answer your question, Councillor Bruce?
Yes, thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you. Right, Councillor Drake, you have a question.
Yes, it was just what I asked earlier on. We saw a map of the some part of the footpath. Can you give me an average of the width of this footpath?
Yeah, so the application that was submitted referred to it as being 3 metres. I think in reality it's more like 4.5 metres. But what I would suggest is that if the committee are minded to accept the proposal and make an order, then that would be for the local authority just to go down and measure up when they set out the terms of that width in that order. But most likely 4.5 metres, I would say.
Yes, 2 metres don't seem very wide, does it? 6 foot, no, in old money.
No, as I say, the terms that the application's made in and what the authority then do to check that they're getting it right are slightly different things. And that is a requirement of the authority to go and do that before it makes the order.
Thank you for that. Councillor Williams, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the report, Gwyn. It's extensive, and in my mind, it's clarified quite a few of the points. We can see from the evidence, historic as well, that the track has been used by vehicle traffic, and so it was difficult for me to accept that the vehicle rights has been lost, but the legislation points that out, that we haven't met the criteria to continue that. So from a legal point of view, I'm not in a position to refute that. I would hope that we'll move forward with this. So it's been coming in for some time. There is, I know there's an action group that would prefer it to be a road. There's a different view on their minds on the legislation in 2006, but nevertheless, as you pointed out, the criteria haven't been met to go for this track as a byway. So I'm going to support the application and move the officer's recommendation.
Thank you, Eddie. I have one question, Gwyn, if I may. Councillor Powell referenced the 2016 DMMO. I'm just wondering what that was about, and because we haven't spoken about that particularly. Gwynty, yeah.
Yeah, the 2016 DMMO, that was probably the initial application for this DMMO. So it's taken a while to get here. There were various attempts to, partly because, as you would have seen from 1936 onwards, there's lots of technical reasons that looked like they were going to frustrate the ability to acquire any rights on there. And so initially we began sort of engaging with landowners to see whether there was an alternative way through. But ultimately, then this application was submitted and it's being resolved now. So it's taken a while to get here, but this is the same application effectively.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Right, Councillor Williams has moved officer's recommendations. I'm happy to second those.
Sorry, I've got a question. So we make a decision today. What's the process for the actual modification order to come into effect?
So what will happen from here? I mean, this is almost or simply the first stage, if you like. So the committee are determining on quite a low burden of proof. So you need to decide whether there's a reasonable allegation that the route should be recorded in the status that we're suggesting it should be recorded in. if you follow that and you decide that that has been met, then the authority will make a definitive map modification order. That will go out. It will be advertised, and any member of the public will have the opportunity to object to that order. That'll be advertised on site and in the papers as any other order would normally be. When that comes back in, if there are objections that remain and that are not removed, then the authority will need to refer that to PEDU, and PEDU will, in all likelihood, I mean, generally in these sorts of cases, then they arrange a date for public inquiry, and there would be a public inquiry, and a planning inspector would then decide ultimately the terms in which it would be recorded, or indeed, if the objection was this modification order shouldn't be allowed to stand because it's truly a county road and county roads aren't recorded on definitive map, then the planning inspector would look at that as well and decide whether that was correct. So the process is make an order, people can object to it, ultimately it goes to public inquiry.
Eddie?
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Gwyn. I meant to ask that question prior to my moving the recommendation. So the reason, particularly for me, to get this decided upon today is to move it forward so that the public, knowing that there is a way, the direction for this to go, because it has been some time to get to this point, and at least it'll be in the public domain and through the legal process in that respect. So I continue with what I said before. Thank you.
Thank you, Eddie. Yeah, just for clarification, Gwyn Teague, have we had any comment, or have we asked for comment from the people who, the landowners that this crosses?
I'll have to refer that one to Dave Hunt.
Oh, David? Are you still with us, Mr. Hunt? There you are.
Yeah, recently, no, I've not heard anything directly that's been given into us. So most of the evidence and all the users, like I say, goes back to the previous report. So not had any more recent comments from them now.
Right, thank you very much. So it appears that there's nobody's actually objecting to this, apart from in terms of Councillor John's concerns about vehicle access to the properties that are at the end of this proposed PROW, which I think Gwyn Teague has managed to address in his response. We have before us proposed and seconded motion to accept officers' recommendations, which I'll read out once more, is that the Vale of Glamorgan Council make a definitive map modification order to record a restricted byway from A to B. Do I see any hands opposed to this from members of the committee? Councillor Bruce, you have your hand up. Is that opposing?
Yes.
In that case, we need to vote on this.
Yes, Chair, we'll do just quickly set a vote up. It will be for or against the application, and it's now been activated, so members should be able to vote.
So you're voting yes in favour of officer's recommendation, no opposed to officer's recommendation, or abstain.
Okay, Chair, everyone's voted. I'm just going to stop it, and the results should be on screen now. So we've got
The results are on screen. Of those voted, the majority are in favour of the application. 4 votes to 1. Therefore, the officer's recommendations are supported. I think that's the order of business for today. I don't think there's any other matters, Gareth, that we need to...
That's it, Chair. Yep, all business has been confirmed for today, Chair, so we completed the business.
In that case, I thank everyone, officers and members and members of the public, for their attendance. Pam, you come on screen. Is there something you want to say?
No, I was just going to say goodbye to everybody.
In that case, good. Yeah. Goodbye. Let's hope we can all go out and enjoy the frosty weather on our various footpaths. Have a good afternoon.
Streams ended.
Thank you, everyone.